The story of the man who stole $224 million, Robert Lee Vesco. Vesco was born in 1935 in Detroit, Michigan. He was raised by his father, who was a worker in a Chrysler factory. During his teenage years, Vesco dropped out of high school and later on in his early 20s began to work for an investment firm. As a young adult, Vesco was working as a traveling salesman, hustling everything he could get his hands on, until one day he came across a small failing valve company that was in desperate need of $125,000 to avoid bankruptcy. Vesco promised to find the money in return for control of the company. In search for potential investors, he moved to New York. And despite the fact that he was broke, he was representing himself as a successful consultant. He began charming investors and eventually he acquired the needed funds and full control of the company. As soon as Vesco took full control of the company, he started misrepresenting his assets and getting large loans in order to purchase bigger companies. And then he was selling these companies' assets in order to repay his loans. He was buying companies using their own money. One of the most characteristic examples of Vesco's talents and confidence was the way that he took over a power plant by appraising the machinery and taking the appraisal to a leasing company in return for a loan. He then used this money to pay the company's debts and issued a preferred stock in the same company and gave it to the owner as compensation. The thing is, the owner could have done the same thing himself. In 1965, Vesco decided to step up his game by listing his company in the stock exchange, which was something that at that moment he could not afford. What he did instead? He bought a failed company called Cryogenics, which was already listed. He then transferred all his assets to Cryogenics and changed its name to the International Controls Corporation. Even though the company was not similar to Cryogenics, Vesco managed to remain listed due to the promise of high returns, and soon his ICC stock value was worth millions, misrepresenting the annual income of the company, which was a little over $200,000. By the age of 35, Vesco came across a company called Investors Overseas. The company was operating several mutual funds and was making profits by commissions from the successful investments. The company was registered in Switzerland and was a big success between small investors and people who were looking to avoid taxes. Bernard Kornfeld, the founder of iOS, found himself in a tight financial situation in 1969 after a bad year full of losses. The company ran out of operating money and Kornfeld ended up in prison. Vesco took the opportunity and offered $5 million to help with the company's financial situation in return for full control of the company. As soon as Vesco acquired iOS, he took advantage of the secrecy and the protection of investors' information, which was there to protect the tax-avoiding customers, meaning there was no monitoring or regulation of his actions and he was acting as he pleased. Customers were approaching the company with suitcases full of money, and Vesco began cashing out the company's biggest investments. The money was then invested in companies in various tax havens around the world. In reality, these were shell companies set up by Vesco. They had no products or employees. They only existed on paper. The shell companies then were investing the money in other shell companies, and after filtering the money between several countries, the money became untraceable. Like this, Vesco stole more than $220 million, making him one of the world's richest men. With the money Vesco stole through his shell companies, he started buying some pretty crazy things. Among other things, the most notable and flamboyant purchase he made was a private Boeing 707 jet, complete with a sauna and a disco. Meanwhile, he continued to live a double life as a successful whiz kid of Wall Street who had saved iOS from collapse. But Vesco's lavish lifestyle was starting to catch up with him, even as he partied in style in the skies. In 1972, the Securities and Exchange Commission filed charges against Vesco, alleging that he had looted at least $224 million. But Vesco had been monitoring the SEC investigation closely. Shortly before the charges were made official, Vesco fled the US on a commercial flight. He allegedly paid hundreds of dollars in excess baggage fees. As rumour had it, his suitcases were stuffed with millions in cash. Sure enough, Vesco did turn up in Costa Rica, where he had promised to invest $42 million. Before long, he was living in a palatial compound, and the government in Costa Rica had passed a law specifically banning his extradition. For the next 20 years, Vesco cruised around Central America and the Caribbean. As soon as the pressure on one country to extradite him grew too great, he moved on to another. His stolen wealth made him untouchable. He was obsessed with the idea of founding his own country, a tax haven where white-collar criminals would be welcome. Thankfully, he never realized that dream, and his spree ended in Cuba, where he was arrested for fraud. After spending a decade in prison, he lived quietly in Havana until his death from cancer in 2007. Ironically, the fraud charge that landed him in jail was for producing a pill that could supposedly cure cancer.